Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrissey. I'm Adam Morrissey. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Ella Ward. Ella is a leading researcher at Ehrenberg-Bass, which is considered to be the world's top marketing sciences organization with a focus on brand identity and brand recognition. Ella, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess just out of curiosity, what's been most fun to you working at the world's best marketing sciences organization?
Yeah, I'm kind of a piece of the furniture at this point. I've been at the Institute 13 or 14 years, actually. So it's certainly evolved. And what's been really exciting is just to see the amount of growth that we've had and the different research streams that we're building and developing. It's been really cool to see it grow.
Yeah, awesome. Well, your work is definitely front and center for a lot of marketers and brand scientists across the world. And so excited to have a conversation about, brands and how brands are interacting differently with consumers and changing over time. Brands are everywhere, and they seem to be growing and growing, especially as there's new ways to reach customers. For example, there were 30,000 new consumer packaged goods launched each year in the United States. 40% of them are still on the shelf after a year. So a lot of turnover and a lot of new brands emerging. So to lay the conversation for this conversation, what is the history of brands? Like, how far back have humans been branding? And then how do we get to this point where it seems like we're just overloaded with brands?
Yeah, well, it goes quite a way back. The word brand actually comes from brander, which is Old Norse for to burn. So we know as early as about 2000 BC, people were branding cattle and pottery as means of sort of claiming ownership. From there, we also know that actually in ancient civilizations, people used images and symbols in marketplaces to sell wares to illiterate persons. So it goes pretty far back. In terms of legislation and I guess this more modern idea of branding that we have, we know the earliest brand trademark was a red triangle, and that was back in 1876. It was a British brand called Bass Ale. So they were the first ones to really take one of those images, apply a trademark to it and say, hey, this is how we identify our products.
Yeah.
So from there, I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, for sure. And from your research, what have you learned about human psychology that explains why we resonate so much with brands and why they're so important to us?
Yeah, I think the word resonate is a really interesting one because if we throw back sort of 20 or 30 years before the scientific revolution in marketing, we really heavily relied on psychology and the social sciences to understand how people do interact with brands. We borrowed theories about relationships, about personality, all kinds of things. So brand love is a really clear example of that. The thing is, we kind of pinched these theories and we applied them to brands in a way they weren't ever really intended for. These theories were based on how humans interact with each other, not how they interact with companies and brands. So over the last 20 to 30 years, we have seen this scientific revolution. And what that really means is we're actually developing our own marketing theories that are about marketing using empirical real-world data. And one of the biggest findings that we have and continue to see is the reality is people actually think very little about brands. So it's a far cry from this idea of brand love and these really deep bonds and connections. Actually, there are thousands upon thousands of brands. And if we were to think about all of them on that deep emotional level, we wouldn't have much time for anything else. So really, we don't think about them much at all.
Yeah, but is there something going on subconsciously that brands are playing into?
When it comes to subconscious and brands, I guess it's a really broad question. To speak from my expertise, which is around visual brand identity. Visual brand identity are those particular brand elements that distinguish a brand's look and feel. So logos, colours, slogans, things like that. They definitely do operate on a subconscious level, but it's more a practicality thing. Your brain uses them as shortcuts because there's so much information that we encounter all the time that our brain needs to cut through that clutter because we couldn't possibly process it all. So when it comes to colours, logos, slogans, we can consciously use them in a shopping environment. So I know my shampoo comes in a purple bottle, so when I look around the shelf, that's what I'm searching for. But it really does happen subconsciously as well, where we notice and pick up things without even realizing. So scanning the shelf, using those particular colors, shapes, labels, just to make our lives easier. And I think that's the aspect of psychology that comes into visual branding. I don't believe that it's this sort of malicious, intentional process of brands to try and weave their way into our subconscious. Really, if you're not going to take advice from your mum or your good friend, it's pretty hard to be convinced by advertising to do something that you weren't going to do anyway.
Yeah, I always think it's an amazing experience. Like when I'll see a particular brand and think like, I would never use that or wear that. And then, I'll find myself a year, maybe 2 years later, being a big fan. There's a famous restaurateur in America named Danny Meyer, and he's got this concept of shared ownership, which is when we talk about, in his case, a restaurant, but in this case, a brand, like it's our own. Like we've ascribed a little bit of our identity to the brand or the products we use.
Interesting. We don't tend to find that so much with our research. I mean, there certainly are examples of it. And if you really consciously think about it and you go, which brands do I prefer? But for the most part, if you think about a good example is the brand of refrigerator you have or the type of tyres that you have on your car, right? I think when we talk about this brand being an identifier or an aspect of ourself, we tend to think about very iconic brands. Often what comes to mind is something like Apple, when people think, I own these particular products because it says something about me. But the number of different products that we have and interact with in our lives, the vast majority of them are ones that we do not think about. We grab them off the shelf. They satisfy a particular need. If they weren't there, we'd probably just buy another brand instead. So I think it's more the exception to the rule rather than the majority.
I think something you're alluding to and something I hear a lot about is the concept of mental availability, which means that buyers think of a particular brand when considering a purchase. You mentioned like the purple shampoo as an association you make that connection with. How do the best companies create mental availability?
Yeah, so mental availability is the propensity or the chance that your brand is thought of or noticed in buying situations. So really the building blocks of mental availability are category entry points. And what category entry points are? They're the reasons or the context that people might encounter when they enter a particular category. So, for example, if I give a category of chocolate, right, there could be any number of category entry points. Typically, we use research to figure out what they are. But to brainstorm, it could be to treat myself or for a Saturday night, to share with my partner, all those kinds of things. So strong mental availability is built off of having really strong and fresh memory links to as many of those contexts as you can that are relevant to our customers. So that's a really important way to build mental availability. But something that's really important to understand is that mental availability is kind of only half the picture. If you build a really strong mentally available brand, which means when people are at the shelf or they're in a particular buying situation, they can think of your brand, which is great. If you aren't physically available for purchase, so if you don't have a particular product or service that meets that need, if you're not present and prominent where the buying is happening, all of that pre-work to build your mental availability is kind of lost. So the best brands really build mental availability alongside physical availability. So overlap is really important. It's about building strong and fresh memory networks for your brand, but equally, it's about building distribution. It's making sure you've got the right product for the right need.
I mean, when you're saying this, it sounds like there's a lot of intentionality that certain brands can take and put into their process. And this probably isn't, maybe it is scientific and maybe it's not, but like what percentage of like a brand success is like within its control versus outside?
I couldn't give you a percent. It would really be just sort of estimating, I guess. And I don't really know. There are certainly internal factors. So if you think about, we talk about mental and physical availability as a framework, and that's essentially what it is. You can apply the laws that we know. So these empirical generalizations are scientific laws about how marketing works. So just in the way that physics has laws around mass, velocity, all those sorts of things, we have laws in marketing, and that's just how marketing works. They're not to be argued with. It's just scientific fact. How well brands actually apply those frameworks, that's kind of at the Institute, that's out of our hands. It's about how can you take this knowledge and apply it. That's the component that's absolutely in the control of brands. What's happening in the outside world, that's totally out of our control. So those bigger macro factors around certain trends or environmental things, financial factors like, the global financial crisis is a really key example. It's not something that brands can control, but they can use these frameworks to make sure that they're best armed to deal with them when they arise.
Yeah, super cool. I'm curious, I have some family members and friends in like the TV and entertainment business. And since they've been in that business, when they watch a show, it's like a completely different experience than for like somebody like me who's not in that world. Mm-hmm. How has being a marketing scientist like changed the way you like buy and interact with like your evaluations of purchases?
Yeah, I'm smiling because my fiance thinks I'm a nightmare. I cannot walk into a supermarket without being there for ages. I critique ads. Every time we watch a movie, I'm pointing out product placement. I hear and see myself do it, and I can't stop. It's just one of those things. And we talk about in seminars often when we talk to marketing practitioners that we are really weird. We pay a lot more attention to brands than anyone else does, and that also sort of warps our perception of what other people see our brand as. So yeah, I definitely fall into that category of, put it this way, I wouldn't come up against me in the branding game. That one where you have to identify the different logos. I'm pretty nifty at it.
Oh, I believe it. And I bet you're like, well, that brand is, sending this message. So I think I'm going to go in another direction, or like whether it's, packaging, I know is one of your specialties. Yeah. What are some things you look for like as a consumer in packaging?
In that sense, I guess I am the same as every other consumer. I look for those particular cues that make my life easier. We tend to buy from a repertoire of brands, which means there are certain products or categories and brands within those that we will buy repeatedly. We shuffle between them, the different brands in our repertoire, depending on what we're looking for at the time. So as a regular consumer, I'm interested in getting the job done. So, I just joked about how I'm in the supermarket for hours, but the reality is I might think that, but I don't spend ages looking and critiquing every single product I pick up. For the most part, I'm racing through because for some reason my fiance insists on shopping on a Friday night. It's the last place I want to be. It is the last place I want to be. So I race through and I'm skimming and I'm grabbing things that are familiar to me. Familiarity is really important when it comes to brand recognition. And so I know that I always purchase this particular brand of curry paste. And when I see it, makes it really easy for me to identify, throw it in my cart. There's nothing in particular that I sort of am going, I'm going to look at the tens of thousands of products that are available in my local supermarket and I'm going to evaluate them based on how environmentally friendly I think they are. That might be a small part of my decision process. Typically, we know that people take up to about 3 seconds to decide on a product at shelf. So this really intense evaluation just doesn't happen in real life.
You mentioned like evaluating different products. You did a paper on competitive links, which I thought was really interesting because like you typically would think like competition's a bad thing, but they serve each other. Could you speak a little bit about what competitive links are, how they form, and how they impact the companies involved?
Yeah, so typically from a branding perspective, we would consider competitive links to be sort of a negative thing. But to explain why, we need a little bit of a background lesson in memory theory, but I promise I won't go too deep or too boring. But to start with, associative network theories are really the oldest, most empirically sound theories of human memory. What they suggest is that when we encounter information in our external environment, our brain will encode it and store it as a concept or a node in our memory. And when that encoding happens, our brain will store that particular concept in a network of information that it thinks is related. So if you want to visualize it, I typically think of a spider web, right? Brand knowledge is stored in a very similar way. So we'll have this brand node that's kind of like a nugget of information, and attached to it are any and all related concepts to that brand. It can be, we talked about visual brand identity, so it could be the brand's logos, colours, its products and services. It could also be particular attributes, any number of things, right? Competitive links are when multiple brands are linked to the same concept in memory. So they're almost sharing a bit of a spider web if you think of it that way. This is important because those links are how we retrieve information from our memory. That's called the spreading activation theory. And what it says is that when we encounter a piece of information in our external environment, it triggers this activation process in our memory. So one of those nodes in our brain will light up, and that will spread throughout that spider web, through all of those links. And it will keep spreading and thinning out until it hits a point of a particular concept that will come to mind. And it will be that which sort of we bring to the forefront of our memory. So if I step you through a very simple hypothetical, right? Maybe I'm walking through Rundle Mall, it's this iconic outdoor mall here in Adelaide. I'm walking through and there's always this caramel popcorn cart and it smells amazing. It really actually is very reminiscent of if you've been to Disneyland. You know how Disneyland always smells like caramel popcorn? It smells like that. So let's say I'm walking through the mall and I think, oh, I'm going to treat myself. That's an example of a category entry point. And I go, when I want to treat myself, I think of the category chocolate. And in my brain, there are multiple brands linked to chocolate, but two of the ones that I purchase regularly in my repertoire are maybe Cadbury, which is like a market-leading supermarket brand, and Haigh's, which is a more premium local brand. So at that point, that popcorn has triggered my activation in my memory. That activation has spread through the category of chocolate and it's spreading to all the associations that are linked to chocolate. Multiple brands are there. But because there's multiple brands, that association spreads pretty thin. Typically only one of them is actually retrieved. So at that point, Haigh's is physically available to me. I can see it. It's on the corner of the mall. I go, oh, I think of Haigh's. In that instance, having competitive links was to the detriment of brands like Cadbury. There are multiple brands linked, which means any one of them can be retrieved, but the likelihood of that happening is diminished. If only one brand is linked, it means they've got a much higher chance of being retrieved from memory. So that's why we say unique memory links are really valuable to brands. That is particularly important when it comes to visual identity. The last thing you want is other brands to be thought of or brought to mind when you show your logo in an ad.
How do brands navigate that, especially I think about toothpaste when I think of competitive links, and especially in the United States, Colgate and Crest. I don't actually use either of them. I use Tom's of Maine. But how is for something that's kind of a commodity, like chocolate or toothpaste, how would a brand, particularly a new entrant, make it so the links are reduced?
Mm-hmm. For a lot of things, competitive links are just part of the sort of complex way you have to navigate a brand, right? There's no way you're ever going to uniquely own a link to the whole category of chocolate. Some things are always going to have competitive links, but it's about trying to make yours stronger and bigger than the rest. So consistently reminding people and reinforcing that particular association makes it stronger. So when it comes to memory links and memory retrieval, the things that are easiest to retrieve are those which we are constantly reminded of. They're nice and fresh in our memory. We see them occur over and over. There are always going to be competitive links for certain product attributes or certain category attributes, but there are certain ones that shouldn't have competitive links, like your visual brand identity. Your visual brand identity is like a signature for your brand. It's a visual stamp of ownership. So you want to try and make those very unique to you. And that means applying things like trademark, stamping out copycat behaviour, really calling it out when it's happening to say, hey, this is mine, and trying to prevent other people from building links to those particular associations. It's a lot easier for some things than others. Category entry points that are really common and popular, like to treat myself, naturally are going to have lots of competitive links, and that's okay. But it's about making sure some of those links are unique, and the ones that are around your proprietary elements, that's particularly important.
Yeah. One thing I think's super interesting, you mentioned how things have changed over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, how do you look at how, the game's changed for brands over the last, call it 10 years or so, with new technologies and new ways to reach customers like social media?
There's been a lot of big changes when it comes to technology. I mean, we could talk about the last 10 years, but even in the last 12 months, we've seen big changes in technology, right? And it doesn't seem to be slowing down. But what I would suggest is one of the biggest changes, if we sort of cast back the last decade, has been this incredible uplift in the ability to collect, store, and analyze big data. And social media has really been a part of that. We've all got now this data footprint that we didn't really have before. And how well brands can leverage that, how they can dip into it is really sort of interesting. And I think it's really had an effect on how successful brands have been able to be. In terms of how it's affected marketing generally, if we're still talking about social media and big marketing, some of the buzzwords that we've sort of seen roll through, they've been replaced with AI now, but previously we were talking a lot about programmatic advertising, which is taking this big data and using it to try and feed people information, ads, commercials that they think are really relevant based on that person's data footprint. The thing is that technology is moving faster than research. So we don't actually have a clear idea of just how effective these strategies really are. So to give you an example, and I think this is something that will be familiar to everyone, I'm sure everyone at some point has maybe purchased a pair of shoes or something online, right? And then for the next week, your feed is just riddled with pictures of that exact shoe from different companies who are selling it. My personal example for the last week, so I'm getting married in March and I booked our honeymoon last week. Ever since, all I'm getting is flight deals, dream honeymoon destinations, all of this stuff that would have been really helpful 3 weeks ago. But because the way programmatic advertising works, it's based on your past browsing and usage behavior. So it's going, hey, this girl's really interested in booking a honeymoon. It's forgetting the fact that I already did that. So as helpful as technology can be, and it's certainly got great potential, I think a lot of it is squandered.
Yeah, it's super interesting hearing you say that, like, the best companies are the ones that are going to be able to use the readily available data. Yeah. A previous guest of mine was worked for professional basketball teams and professional baseball teams and like data analytics in sports. And he was saying the same thing, is like there's just way more data and way more ways to use it. Mm-hmm. And the best teams or the best companies are the ones that are able to use that data to the fullest extent.
Exactly. I think for a lot of companies and, people in general, there's so much data that we go, I don't know what to do with it all. It's not just about having the data, it's about knowing what to do with it and knowing how to use it to build predictive patterns rather than just describe past behavior. Yeah.
How have you seen any companies like, you mentioned the last 12 months, the last 10 years is like really a lot of change. Have you seen any companies that have like been around for a while and failed to adapt? Is there one that comes to mind to you? And if you don't want to like say them by name, you could just say like a large XYZ.
I guess switching from big data, to give an example of failing to adapt to evolving technology, it's not so much data related, but something that I find really interesting is the capsule coffee category. Capsule like coffee like pods have actually been around since the late 80s, which I didn't know, because to me I thought, no, surely that was a 2010s kind of thing. And the reason I think collectively view it that way is because actually that's when the boom of capsule coffee happened. But they've been around since the late 80s, but Nestle had nearly 2,000 patents or something based on capsule coffee and the machines. And they only started to lapse in about 2010. And at that point, a bunch of instant coffee brands really jumped on that bandwagon. They were forced to innovate. They were forced to sort of see this upcoming trend and totally adapt not only their sort of marketing practice, but actually their whole business, because it's, not a totally different category, but it's certainly very different to instant coffee, which was huge at the time. There were a number of brands that didn't do that didn't jump on that bandwagon, who didn't see it as valuable for whatever reason. And didn't anticipate that in 2016, just 6 years later, so when all these patents lapsed in about 2010, 2012, all of these competitors jumped on. We saw a real boom in capsule coffee. In 2016, it actually totally surpassed instant coffee. So all of those brands that failed to innovate at that time were left behind and stayed behind, basically. And even today, it's a huge market. It's, well over $12 billion. I think they're predicting over $13 billion worldwide this year. So, that's a really good example of balancing innovation. You don't want to follow things down a rabbit hole that lead to a bucket load of money but take you nowhere. But at the same time, if you don't keep up with the trends, if you don't use data to actually follow what's happening in the marketplace, if you're left behind, you'll stay there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It does seem like, at least for my own, I'm surprised. Anecdotally, I would have expected capsule coffee to dip back down, because in my circles, everyone's trying to make the most premium coffee at home with their espresso machines. But I suppose it makes a lot of sense that the capsules kind of took over. People already have the machines, and those brands won. You mentioned taking advantage of opportunities. Kind of on the flip side of that, do you think there are some brands that emerged over the last several years that really did something well? We don't have to talk about Liquid Death if you don't want to talk about Liquid Death, but to me, you're familiar with Liquid Death?
I actually am not familiar with the term, so I'm ready to learn.
Oh, Liquid Death. Liquid Death is it might be a US thing, but it's a canned water concept.
Oh, okay.
Called Liquid Death, and their tagline is "Murder Your Thirst." And it's got a skull on it. It's got really cool branding, and the way they got really big was in a lot of the music festival cultures. Canned drinks are better for music festivals, I guess. So, they got really big, and it kind of didn't look and feel like a water. When I first saw it, I thought it was an energy drink of sorts. But they got really big in the US. So I'd be curious, if not Liquid Death, if there's other brands that you think that have emerged over the last several years that you think did a really nice job.
Interesting. No, we don't have that. Well, I certainly haven't seen it, at least. But my initial thought would be, yes, branding and everything has a part to play. People want the product to look nice. So not to diminish that. But my thoughts are, if we're talking about music festivals and things, typically they have quite a restricted menu of items that you're able to purchase. So if you can get your product in that lineup, that's what we call distribution, and that's about physical availability. So you're right there, prominent where the buying is actually happening. So it gives you really good leverage in that instance, particularly in a music festival. If you're a small brand and people aren't aware of you, it's very low chance that you'll be purchased on shelf in a supermarket where there are thousands of options. But if you're in a music festival, you've got nice broad distribution. You've gained access to a bunch of people essentially you didn't have access to before. So I would suggest that distribution had a really big part to play, and it probably helped to build their mental availability for a bunch of people who wouldn't have seen or noticed them prior to that. So I think that's probably a good example, and a good example of innovation, like you say, because other brands that weren't packaging in cans, maybe that's why they were missing out on that opportunity. So also I think we see a lot of advances when it comes to packaging, particularly around environmental factors, so needing to reduce environmental footprint, things like that. Other brands that come to mind, I can't think of any off the top of my head. In terms of really new, innovative brands. Really, if we're still sinking into that conversation about data, I don't know if you've seen it, but the list of the top 100 brands of 2023 has been released. And in terms of their brand value, number one is Amazon, number two is Apple, number three is Google, and number four is Microsoft. Right? So let's think about, what do those four brands have in common? They collect and sell big data, huge data, right? Their business, their primary business at this point is data. It's not a virtual marketplace. It's the sale of people's personal data and personal footprint. That shows you the value that people see in it, because people are buying it. Sorry, by people I mean companies. But those are those top brands. So I think really the brands that have been able to leverage that kind of technological innovation, they're the ones that we're seeing an absolute boom in how successful they are.
That's fascinating because, you probably look back not too far back, like the top brands would have been like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Would be like a top brand.
And Coca-Cola still, I think, is a really great example. So Coca-Cola was founded, funnily enough, actually. So speaking about the original trademark, that triangle that we talked about, which was Bass Ale, that was back in 1876. Coca-Cola was founded only 10 years later. So back in 1886, Coca-Cola was founded. And if you go and look at those images, what I find striking is just how similar it actually looks to today. So we can talk about the companies that adapt and really adopt this innovation and technology, which is so important to keep moving. I would suggest that one of the strongholds that Coca-Cola has, and one of the reasons it's so successful, has been its ability to resist change despite these huge changes that are happening in the marketplace. And that's why it's such an iconic brand, because it's used that colour red for since its foundation all that time ago. Even though we've seen this advancement in packaging where, all bottles are basically plastic now, that's their primary business, they still have a very iconic glass bottle shape. They've managed to hold on to that, even though they've, leveraged these advances and they're making plastic bottles. We still associate Coke with that nice glass bottle Coke. So adapting and modifying based on change is really important to keep up with the trends that are important, but resisting the changes that are not important. So making sure you're being consistent is really key to build strong memory networks. Consistency is the foundation of a strong memory network. And so being consistent where it counts and adapting where you can, I think that makes a really nice balance.
That's super interesting. I mean, when we think about psychology and stuff, obviously, I'd be curious, like if like Coca-Cola was using brand science, or they just thought like, hey, red's kind of a power color and this script's kind of classic looking and cool. Like how much of like this branding science is built around the brands that like have just been established powers and us trying to evaluate things relative to what we're familiar with?
Mm-hmm. It really depends on the organization, how familiar they are with marketing science. We talk about 30 years, but in the spectrum of, global marketing and branding, that's a relatively short time. It's certainly increasing the amount of people who are aware of marketing science and are able to apply it to their brands. But there is certainly a large portion of companies and brands that are still using outdated theories around marketing and how branding works. So it really depends on the organization. And we find that through the different companies that we talk to, it even depends within an organisation. There'll be different branches where people are more or less familiar with marketing science. So I think you're right. There is a lot of marketing that still people are basing on gut feel. But to me, that's missing an opportunity. We know these facts to be true. We've seen them for decades now. The way that we do our marketing science is through repeated executions and observations. So we test the same theories over and over again in many different categories, many different countries, across lots of different time periods, and we see the same patterns hold. So if you're not aware of those patterns and you're not able to apply them to your own brands, then I think you're at a disadvantage.
Yeah. You mentioned AI earlier. Do you have like an early prediction as to how, like what the impact of AI will be on the type of work you guys do?
Look, I'll be honest. I try to keep my ear to the ground on these things, so I'm aware, but tech and I really avoid any kind of forecasting when it comes to tech because that's outside of my wheelhouse. What I will say is at this point, I'm not too worried about artificial intelligence stealing my job. I do, however, think, though, it's really interesting to see how it's evolved, particularly with something like ChatGPT, where all of a sudden it's in the public domain. And the fact that they're continuing to advance it, obviously at the moment it's a little bit outdated with the information that it's fed, but it's certainly advancing and it's changing what we're doing. I say I'm not worried it's going to steal my job, but I do think we all need to make room for a co-pilot. And I really like that term. It kind of frames AI as a tool that goes in our toolbox, right? I think of it as something that can help me do my job, not to replace my job. And I think that applies no matter what industry you're in. It's something that we all need to get used to, and we have to understand how it works and how we can use it to our advantage. But I wouldn't say I'm expert enough to understand quite yet if we're looking towards a Westworld future.
Yeah, of course not. But do you think brands will use like AI to like refine their marketing science and data processing?
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way that we saw big data change the way that we were fed advertising and content, I think there's certainly scope for AI in that space. So creating more personalized content. We had a visitor come from the Journal of Advertising who was talking about the potential to actually use people's, visual footprint, so what people actually look like, and use AI to create ads with a person in it. So you can be fed an ad on your Facebook page and you're in it, which is pretty wild. And I think the ethical sort of questions surrounding AI are still very much up in the air because we're not sure quite what it's capable of yet. But there are certainly different ways that AI will be used and is already starting to be used. Feeding people particular ad content and really fine-tuning that, I think, will be a part of it. Even the creative aspect of design, now that we know we've got visual aspect of GPT and other AI technologies, I still believe that it's the companies that are using, developing their own AI that are really going to lead the forefront of that innovation, more so than the companies who are still trying to learn and adapt as we go.
Yeah, it's very common for new technologies to be out there, but like the majority of companies not be able to use them. So to be ushered by, I believe they'd be called value enablers, somebody to help them get the benefits of the technology, I think will be really important.
Yeah.
Ella, you've been really generous with your time. Before I let you go, any reading materials or content sources you'd recommend for people interested in keeping up on brand sciences and marketing sciences?
Absolutely. So we have a number of books that are designed for industry practitioners, so they're really easily digestible. Our first one, so if you're not familiar with the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, our first book is called How Brands Grow, and it was written by our director, Byron Sharp. It's got all of those foundational laws of marketing science, but it's in really bite-sized information. We've also got a part 2 now, which is really looking at emerging markets and some different categories, services and luxury. My favourite, I'm biased, but we've got a book called Building Distinctive Brand Assets, and that's all about your brand's visual identity. And then our latest and greatest by Professor Jenny Romanick is called Better Brand Health, and it's all about brand tracking and brand health metrics. So if any of those tickle your fancy, they're available, I believe, on all kinds of online book retailers. So that would be my starting point. If you really want to nerd out, I've also got a thesis in the public domain. My PhD is available, but I wouldn't recommend that for bedside reading.
Noted. Well, we'll have links to all those in the show notes, but Ella, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thanks for listening to Tuesdays with Morrissey. That conversation was with Ella Ward. Ella is a leading researcher at Ehrenberg-Bass, which is considered to be the world's top marketing sciences organization. What I thought was so cool about the conversation with Ella is just how much is going on behind the scenes of the brands we interact with. And for me, it just got me thinking about how much sophistication is in the space and how much we're subconsciously evaluating the brands we use. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend and make sure to follow along wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks. See you soon.